The quiet exit. They didn't announce it. No broadcast. No warning. No final demand. No dramatic ultimatum delivered through trembling alien diplomats or holographic war councils. Humanity simply went quiet. Across the Orion Arm, where the Galactic Council had once tolerated Earth as a useful junior species, ships stopped responding. Military outposts blinked offline one by one like dying stars. Trade corridors that once thrummed with human freighters fell silent, their transponders erased as if they had never existed. At first, the Council assumed the usual things. Human chaos. Internal collapse. Another primitive species reaching its predictable ceiling of violence and self-destruction. The Vector High Speaker even made a joke during the emergency assembly. "I suppose the monkeys finally dropped their last grenade on themselves." Laughter followed. Nervous, but still laughter. Then the outer colonies reported something strange. No wreckage. No debris fields. No distress signals. Just emptiness. And a single repeating transmission looping across abandoned human channels. "We are no longer participating in your system." No threat. No anger. Just withdrawal. Admiral Riker of the Scythian fleet reviewed the reports 3 times before speaking. "That's not surrender," he muttered. "That's removal." No one listened. Because arrogance, in galactic politics, is a currency more stable than truth. On the Council capital world of Varellon Prime, Ambassador Elias Mercer stood in silence as 23 alien delegates shouted over one another. "You cannot simply leave the Collective Defense Accords," the Dravex warlord snapped, his armored mandibles clacking. "You are a registered asset species." Mercer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We are not assets," he said calmly. "We were participants." That distinction was ignored. A holographic display flickered above the chamber. Star maps. Human trade zones. Military alliances. Defense pacts spanning 147 systems. All of them now marked withdrawn. The Council President leaned forward. "Ambassador Mercer, this is irresponsible. The galaxy is destabilized. Piracy has already increased near your sectors. You are obligated under—" Mercer interrupted softly. "Obligated?" A pause. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Not cruelly. Just tired. "You invaded our mining colonies in the Cygnus Rift and called it resource arbitration. You sanctioned biological experimentation on human prisoners and labeled it interspecies research ethics. You sold our children's neural templates as entertainment substrates and called it cultural exchange." His eyes lifted. "And you're concerned about obligation?" Silence rippled through the chamber. Even alien arrogance has a limit. It just takes longer to reach it. The President tried again. "Humanity benefits from Council protection. Without us." Mercer finally laughed. It was short. Dry. Almost pitying. "Protection?" He tapped a single command on his console. Every hologram in the chamber shifted. Dozens of Council war zones lit up in red. Supply chains collapsing. Defense grids failing. Patrol fleets stranded mid-jump. Entire sectors where human logistics officers had quietly been the only reason order existed. And now, no humans. No maintenance. No coordination. No silent repairs in the background. Just entropy, finally allowed to do its job. "You never noticed," Mercer said softly. "Because we made it look easy." A Vector Admiral growled. "You're bluffing. Your species is barely—" Mercer cut him off. "You still think we were the ones being evaluated?" That line landed wrong. Even the translators paused. Then Mercer straightened his coat. "This meeting is concluded. Humanity has exited the Council framework effective immediately." A beat. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Good luck." The transmission ended. 2 weeks later, the first system collapsed. Not from war. From logistics failure. A Council armada deployed to suppress piracy in the Tarsus corridor ran out of coordinated fuel routing. Jump gates misaligned. Repair schedules vanished. Ships began drifting, stranded between stars like dead thoughts. Pirates didn't even fire the first shot. They just waited. Because suddenly, the galaxy was no longer organized. And chaos, for the first time in centuries, had room to breathe. On Varellin Prime, panic replaced arrogance. "Re-establish contact with the humans," the president ordered. "We can't," came the reply from communications. "All channels are black. Not jammed. Not blocked. Just absent." A junior analyst whispered something no one wanted to hear. "It's like they deleted themselves from the network." That was when Admiral Riker finally understood. "This isn't withdrawal," he said quietly. "It's decoupling." The room turned to him. He continued, voice tightening. "They weren't part of our system. They were stabilizing it. And now they've stepped out." A pause. Then the real horror arrived. "Do you understand what that means?" Riker asked. No one answered. So he did it for them. "It means we were never in control." Deep in uncharted space, beyond Council jurisdiction, a dark fleet drifted in formation. Human ships. Not warships. Not merchant vessels. Something older. Quieter. Each hull marked with no insignia, only a single phrase etched in multiple languages. "We kept your lights on." At the center stood a vessel the Council had never catalogued. The Eidolon Ark. Inside, Admiral Mercer watched the galaxy fade on tactical display. A subordinate officer spoke from behind him. "They're collapsing faster than projected." Mercer nodded. "Of course they are." A pause. "Do we intervene?" That question hung heavier than war ever could. Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the star map, at thousands of systems now flickering into instability. Then he said something that would later be recorded in Council archives as the beginning of the end of the old order. "No." He turned away. "Let them discover what happens when they stand on their own architecture." The officer hesitated. "And if they fall apart?" Mercer's expression didn't change. "Then they were never built to stand." The ship's engines flared silently. The human fleet moved deeper into the void. Not fleeing. Not retreating. Just stepping aside. And somewhere behind them, an entire galaxy began to realize something terrifying. The humans hadn't been part of the Council. They had been holding it together. And now, they weren't anymore. The structure beneath the stars. The first systems didn't fail loudly. That was the worst part. No explosions. No dramatic invasions. No cinematic betrayals or heroic last stands broadcast across the galaxy. Just silence where function used to be. A navigation relay in the Carthan belt stopped correcting jump drift. 3 Council cruisers missed their exit window and emerged inside a dwarf star's gravity well. A mining consortium on Altaris Prime discovered their atmospheric processors were still working, technically, but no longer calibrated. The air grew thin in increments too subtle to notice until workers started collapsing mid-shift. By the time alarms were raised, half the station had already been breathing wrong for 6 hours. The Council called it localized technical degradation. Humans would have called it what it was: dependency collapse. On Varellin Prime, the Council chamber had transformed into something closer to a panic ward. Delegates no longer argued. They interrupted. They accused. They demanded impossible things from systems that no longer responded with human efficiency. "Restore the human logistics interface," one screamed. "It has been purged," replied the systems officer. "Then restore it again." A pause. "It does not exist to restore." That answer did not help. Admiral Riker stood alone in the observation corridor of the Scythian command ship, watching fleet formations attempt recalibration without human coordination protocols. They were failing. Not in battle. In spacing. In timing. In the 1,000 invisible threads that once made a galaxy-scale military machine function like a single organism. "Who taught them to do this?" asked a junior officer behind him. Riker didn't turn. The humans didn't teach us, he said quietly. They compensated for us. A beat. That's worse. Across the void, in the hidden reaches where the Eidolon arc drifted, humanity was not celebrating. There were no cheers. No vengeance feasts. No speeches about liberation or superiority. Just work. Always work. The human fleet wasn't large. It never had been. That was the misconception the Council had always clung to, that power was measured in hulls and guns and visible fleets. But human strength had never been in what could be seen. It was in what could be maintained. Captain Imani Voss stood in the operations bay, reviewing cascading failure reports from across Council space. 27 more systems are requesting emergency stabilization protocols, she said. Lieutenant Halden snorted. Requesting. Cute. Like they didn't spend a century calling us pests. Voss didn't look up. People don't request help when they think the floor will always hold. She tapped the display. A cluster of red lights pulsed across the map. They're learning gravity still exists. The Council finally did what it always did in moments of fear. It weaponized arrogance. Emergency Resolution 88C was passed within hours. All remaining Council fleets were ordered to reassert control over abandoned human-maintained infrastructure zones and restore galactic order. No mention of gratitude. No mention of dependency. Just control. Admiral Riker read the directive twice. Then a third time. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something very close to dread. They're going to occupy human-built systems, he said. A strategist nodded. Yes. To stabilize them. Riker exhaled slowly. They think the systems are the territory. No one understood what he meant. Not yet. The first attempt at occupation happened at the Kepler relay ring. It was a beautiful structure, hundreds of orbital platforms linked by gravitational tethers, forming a navigation nexus that controlled travel across 12 sectors. It had been designed by humans, and quietly maintained by them for decades without ceremony or recognition. The Council fleet arrived expecting compliance systems to engage. They did not. Instead, the ring activated its autonomous defense architecture. Not weapons. Not at first. Just locks. The fleet found itself unable to dock, unable to interface, unable to transmit command authorization. Every access point rejected Council credentials. A Vector captain snarled. Override it! We can't, his engineer replied, voice rising. There's no central override node. It's distributed. Every segment is independent. That's absurd. It's human design. That phrase now carried a weight it never had before. Then the ring spoke. Not with language. With function. Docking corridors sealed. Navigation lanes rerouted. Gravity shears activated in carefully controlled arcs that pushed Council ships out of formation without firing a single shot. No destruction. Just expulsion. The fleet was gently, inexorably removed from the structure. Like dust brushed off a table. A tactical officer whispered, They're not defending it. Riker watched the feed. No, he said. They're rejecting us. On Virelin Prime, the political situation collapsed into open fracture. You promised control, a delegate shouted at the president. We had control, came the response. Then the humans removed themselves. And now? A long pause. Then, quieter. Now we discover what we were standing on. That was when the Council began to understand the second truth. The humans had not been integrated into galactic infrastructure. They had been the interface layer between chaos and stability. And they had removed themselves without damaging anything. Which meant they could have done worse. Much worse. At any time. Far away, in the drifting silence between systems, Captain Voss received an encrypted transmission from a human deep-field scout. She opened it. It contained a single line of telemetry. Council forces attempting system seizure. Non-hostile compliance failing. Request guidance. Voss leaned back in her chair. Guidance, she repeated softly. Halden frowned. We're not even there. I know. She studied the map again. Then made a decision that would never appear in council history books, because the council would never admit it happened. Send them nothing, she said. Halden blinked. Nothing? Voss nodded. Let them learn the difference between owning a system and understanding it. A pause. Then she added, almost amused. They always said we were parasites. She gestured at the failing council. Fleets flickering across the map. Funny thing about parasites. They don't design the host. Back at Kepler, the council fleet finally broke formation. Not from enemy fire. From confusion. From misalignment. From the sudden realization that every maneuver they attempted had already been accounted for, neutralized before execution. Riker watched as ships drifted apart, unable to coordinate thrust vectors that no longer synced with the station's logic. A junior officer whispered, They didn't attack us. Riker's voice was low. No. They just stopped cooperating with our mistakes. And somewhere deep inside Council command structures, a terrifying conclusion began to form. Not spoken. Not agreed upon. But inevitable. If humanity had wanted to cripple them, they wouldn't have left. They would have stayed. The dead of systems. By the third cycle of collapse, the Council stopped calling it technical degradation. They started calling it what it felt like. Ghost failure. Because everything still existed. The fleets were still there. The stations still rotated. The economies still had numbers attached to them. But none of it behaved like it remembered being alive. On the border of the Orhan expanse, a Council dreadnought tried to execute a standard interdiction maneuver, and instead found itself locked in a loop of redundant authority checks. Each layer of command insisted on verification from a layer that no longer responded. A captain screamed into the bridge comms, "Override the override!" The systems officer stared at the console. "There is no override node." "That's impossible! It's human architecture," the officer said again, quieter now. "It doesn't fail. It withdraws permission." And somewhere, deep in the machine logic of the ship, that sentence became a problem it could not solve. On Virelin Prime, the Council President aged visibly in public view. Not biologically. Politically. Those were different things in galactic governance. "You're telling me," the President said slowly, "that every major infrastructure corridor, every logistics chain, every fleet coordination grid..." He stopped. The analyst finished it for him. "Was originally optimized and stabilized by human auxiliary systems." "Yes." A silence followed. Then the President asked the question no one wanted phrased. "Where are they?" No one answered immediately. Because the truth had become uncomfortable in its simplicity. The humans were not hiding. They were not negotiating. They were not retaliating. They had simply stepped outside the system and left it running on its own assumptions. And assumptions, when left alone, rot. Far beyond Council jurisdiction, inside the quiet shadow lanes between star clusters, humanity observed. Not as conquerors. Not as victims. As engineers watching a machine they had finally unplugged. Captain Imani Voss stood beside a holographic table showing cascading instability graphs. Lieutenant Halden leaned against the console, sipping something that definitely violated at least 3 Council bioregulations. "You ever feel bad about this?" he asked. Voss didn't look up. "About what?" "All of it collapsing." She considered that. Then shrugged slightly. "They called us parasites." Halden smirked. "Yeah." A pause. So, she said, tapping the display. "Parasites don't design life support systems for the host." She zoomed in on a collapsing trade corridor. "That's not collapse. That's correction." The first real violence after the withdrawal didn't come from humans. It came from the Council itself. Panic is a poor strategist, but an excellent arsonist. 3 factions of the Council attempted to seize control of remaining human-built infrastructure nodes by force, each believing the others were responsible for sabotage. The result was predictable. And ugly. A border skirmish near the Lyran Gate escalated into full fleet engagement when 2 Council admirals discovered their navigation permissions had been altered mid-jump. Entire squadrons emerged into the wrong gravitational plane and collided before either side even realized they were fighting in the same space. Then the pirates arrived. They always do. Not because chaos invites them. Because structure kept them out. And structure had just been removed. On the human Ark fleet, the mood shifted. Not to fear. To evaluation. Because now the galaxy was doing something humans understood very well. It was adapting poorly. Admiral Mercer watched the tactical feeds with the expression of a man reading a familiar book with new margins. "They're escalating internal conflict," a systems analyst reported. Mercer nodded. "Yes." "They're blaming each other for infrastructure failure." "Yes." "They're deploying military force against maintenance systems." Mercer finally sighed. "Of course they are." A junior officer frowned. "Sir, should we intervene?" That question again. Always that question. Mercer turned slightly. "Why would we?" The officer hesitated. "Because it's collapsing." Mercer's voice was calm. "No. It's revealing what was always there." The twist came quietly. Not with a weapon. Not with a betrayal. But with discovery. A Council research vessel, attempting to salvage a derelict human logistics hub, accidentally accessed a dormant archival layer embedded in the system architecture. It was not encrypted. It was not hidden. It was simply irrelevant until now. The message activated automatically. A recorded human voice spoke. "If you're hearing this, you've exceeded the safety margin we set." The Council crew froze. The voice continued conversational. Almost tired. "We told you once. We maintain systems, not ownership. If we leave, you inherit exactly what you asked for." A pause. Then, "Congratulations," the researcher whispered. "Is this a threat?" The ship's AI responded instantly. "No." Another pause. Then, more uncertainly. "Analysis. This is documentation of voluntary disengagement protocols. It includes failsafes." The captain snapped. "Failsafes for what?" The AI hesitated. Then answered. "For us." Silence. Then the recording resumed. "You called us junior species. So we behaved like one." A soft, almost amused tone. "We stopped fixing what you insisted wasn't broken." And then the final line. "Enjoy independence." The transmission ended. That was when Admiral Riker understood the true nature of the withdrawal. He stood alone in his command chamber as reports flooded in, systems stabilizing only where humans had chosen to leave residual automation active. Not everywhere. Only selectively. Only where failure would not cascade into extinction. "Controlled disengagement," he whispered. A strategist nearby asked. "Sir?" Riker didn't look away from the star map. "They didn't abandon us." He exhaled slowly. "They downgraded us." Across the galaxy, something unexpected began to happen. Some systems stabilized. Others didn't. But patterns emerged. Where Council leadership attempted to seize control violently, systems degraded faster. Where cooperation was attempted, partial recovery occurred. Where human-designed infrastructure was respected, it quietly reactivated dormant maintenance loops. Not full restoration. Not obedience. Just allowance. As if the system was waiting to see if its operators had learned anything. And that realization hurt more than collapse ever could. Because it meant the galaxy wasn't punishing them. It was testing them. Back on the human fleet, Halden watched the data shift. "So what now?" he asked. Voss didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at a single region of space where Council factions were now openly fighting over a decaying logistics hub. Then she said, "Now we find out if they can build what they destroyed." Halden laughed once. "Optimistic." Voss finally smiled. "It's not optimism." A pause. "It's workload forecasting." And far behind them, In the broken symmetry of a once orderly galaxy, the Council finally faced the truth it had refused to see. The humans had never been conquered. They had never been contained. They had been holding the system stable long enough for everyone else to believe stability was natural. And now that they had stepped away, the galaxy was learning what humans had always known. Order is not inherited. It is maintained. Or it dies. When the hands that held it let go, the Council called it a crisis. Humanity called it Tuesday. The difference mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. By the fourth cycle, the galaxy was no longer simply failing, it was reorganizing itself through pain. Borders meant less. Authority meant less. Even fleets, once symbols of dominance, had become expensive liabilities drifting through increasingly unreliable navigation lanes. And still, the humans did nothing. That silence was now the most terrifying thing in the galaxy. On Virelin Prime, the Council chamber no longer resembled governance. It resembled triage. Delegates shouted over collapsing data streams, arguing over jurisdictions that no longer functioned, laws that no longer applied, and fleets that no longer responded as units. Send the Third Armada to secure the Kitharus relay. It doesn't have coordination architecture anymore. Then rebuild it. With what engineers? Someone snapped. The humans built the core protocols. A pause. That sentence landed differently now. No longer insult. Now fact. Admiral Riker stood before the tactical display, watching what remained of Council cohesion flicker like a failing heartbeat. A junior officer spoke carefully. Sir, there are reports that human-designated safe corridors are still functioning. Ships that remain within them are experiencing stability. Riker didn't respond immediately. Then, and outside them? Failure rate increases exponentially. Silence. The officer hesitated. Sir, are the humans guiding this somehow? Riker finally turned. His voice was low. No. They're observing. A pause. Then quieter. And we are being graded. Far beyond the Council's reach, the human fleet had changed positions. Not advancing. Not retreating. Repositioning. The Eidolon Ark floated at the center of a sparse formation, its systems calm, its crew steady. No urgency. No panic. Only calculation. Captain Imani Voss reviewed the latest galaxy-wide stability metrics. Council fragmentation reached 47%, she reported. Lieutenant Halden leaned back. That's generous wording for they're tearing themselves apart. Voss nodded. Yes. A beat. They're also adapting. Halden raised an eyebrow. That's new. Slowly, she added. Inconsistently. But yes. She zoomed in on a cluster of systems where Council forces had stopped fighting and begun cooperating. Not because they agreed. Because survival forced it. Halden frowned. So what's the verdict? Voss looked at the data for a long moment. Then said something that carried more weight than any fleet order. They might actually learn. The turning point came in the Lyran corridor. A critical logistics choke point, once entirely maintained by human auxiliary systems, had collapsed into competing Council factions attempting to seize control. For weeks, it had been chaos. Then something changed. A Council engineer, Vector, young, unremarkable, did something no one else had tried. He stopped issuing commands and started reading the system. Not forcing it. Not overriding it. Understanding it. When he adjusted a single parameter instead of rewriting the structure, the corridor didn't reject him. It responded. Not fully. Not immediately. But enough. A maintenance loop reactivated. Then another. Then a stabilizer node came online after 3 cycles of silence. On Virelin Prime, analysts were stunned. It's responding, one whispered. It's actually responding. Admiral Riker watched the report and exhaled slowly. So it begins, he said. The Council, however, interpreted it differently. Arrogance, once wounded, becomes desperate. This proves control is still possible, the President declared. We can restore the systems. A strategist hesitated. Sir, the systems are not restoring. They are cooperating with specific behavior patterns. Explain. Another pause. They only stabilize when operators stop forcing outcomes. Silence. Then the president said the words that doomed the old order. Then we will train them to comply. The second mistake began immediately. Council fleets re-entered human-designed infrastructure zones, not to cooperate, but to enforce correct usage protocols. It failed within hours. Because human systems did not resist force. They ignored it. Navigation corridors simply rerouted around unauthorized authority nodes. Docking systems refused interaction. Fleet coordination overlays desynchronized entire task groups that attempted centralized command structures. One admiral screamed into comms, "Why won't it obey?" The answer came from his own engineer, almost hollow. Because it was never built to. And then humanity did something unexpected again. They spoke. Not to the council leadership. Not through formal channels. But across every remaining active neutral frequency. A single transmission, repeated galaxy-wide. Admiral Mercer's voice. Calm. Unhurried. Final in a way that wasn't threatening, just absolute. You are not failing because we left. A pause. You are failing because we stopped compensating for your assumptions. Another pause. You are now interacting with reality directly. That line caused more damage than any weapon ever built. Because it reframed everything. Not as sabotage. Not as betrayal. But as exposure. On the human arc, Halden watched the reaction. They don't like that message, he said. Voss nodded. Truth rarely tests well under stress. A beat. Are we sure about this? She didn't look away from the data. We never controlled them, she said. We just prevented them from learning the cost of not being controlled. Halden frowned. And now? Now the galaxy was learning. The final confrontation, if it could be called that, did not happen between fleets. It happened between ideas. The Council proposed a galaxy-wide reintegration mandate. Humans must resume auxiliary system management under regulated oversight. It was voted down. Not by humanity. But by systems that no longer required permission to function. Entire sectors rejected the mandate automatically. Not politically. Mechanically. A logistics AI, once human-built and quietly embedded across Council infrastructure, issued a final status report. Requested directive conflicts with operational stability. Then it deactivated Council override access. Permanently. Admiral Riker stood alone as the Council chamber emptied around him. Delegates abandoning their posts, systems failing one by one, authority dissolving like mist under sunlight. A junior officer approached. Sir, what do we do now? Riker didn't answer immediately. He looked at the star map. At the collapsing structures. At the quiet human fleet still watching from the edge of known space. Then he said, We learn. A pause. And if we fail? Riker's expression hardened, not with anger. With understanding. Then we finally understand what they were doing for us. Far away, Captain Voss received the final stabilization report. The galaxy was no longer collapsing. But it was no longer stable either. It was transitioning. Halden leaned over. So, victory? Voss considered the word. Then shook her head. No. She closed the display. This is what happens when adults stop managing a system and leave children with the blueprint. A pause. Then, quieter. Whether they grow up is no longer our decision. And in the silence that followed, humanity did something the Council had never truly understood. They didn't return. They didn't conquer. They didn't demand repayment. They simply watched. Because for the first time in centuries, the galaxy was no longer being held together by invisible hands. And now, it would have to learn how to hold itself. And